For a while, Lefty and Ol Blu simply stood on that chilly cliffside terrace, listening to the cold mountain wind as it whistled past them, rattling the dead chicken's metallic feathers in steady intervals. As they stared in silence at the skeletal remains of the once fearsome beast, they wondered what possibly could have defeated such a monstrous titan. Later visitors to the food tabernacle would eventually deduce that the chicken had actually starved to death. The same magics which had transformed it into an abhorrent beast had also allowed it to survive on very little food. However, it still required some food to survive, and if someone was supposed to have been feeding it, they had clearly stopped long ago. Further study of its chambers would reveal that it had actually been sustaining itself entirely by eating those ill-fated adventurers who came to fight it. That occasional meal of raw flesh, combined with periodic rainfall which provided drinking water, had been enough to keep the chicken going for many years, until eventually its own terrifying reputation worked against it. At some point, people simply realized that it was suicidal to confront the beast, and so stopped challenging it altogether. With its only source of food gone, the chicken had ironically succumbed to hunger atop the food tabernacle, collapsing in the same arena where it had killed so many, allowing the strong mountain winds to strip the flesh from its bones until only a bare skeleton clad in its iconic metallic feathers remained. Of course, at the time, neither Lefty nor Ol Blu could have possibly known that was the case, and even if they had, it wouldn't have changed much of anything. After spending several moments speculating, they both realized that it didn't really matter, and promptly stopped caring altogether. In the end, how the creature died wasn't important. All that mattered was that it was dead, and with its death, Lefty was free to claim the treasure it had been guarding for so many years. It didn't take long for them to find it. The cliffside terrace which had served as the chamber of the beast was not all that complex. With a sheer drop on one side, and high unassailable rock walls on the other, it only took a few moments to thoroughly explore the entire area. Aside from a few interesting shaped rocks, and a crude nest-like area that the giant chicken slept in, there was only one other spot of interest. A perfectly rectangular hole roughly the size of a doorway, which had been carved right into the rock, situated on the far side of the arena behind the creature's nest. Walking inside with Ol Blu perched once more on his shoulder, Lefty found himself in a short hallway that emptied into a simple but elegant room, its walls without decoration, but perfectly smooth and expertly crafted, just like the rest of the tabernacle. The room's only unique feature was a series of small holes which had been drilled into the ceiling, through which sunlight filtered in, creating diagonal columns of light which all pointed towards the only furnishing in the room, a single ornate pedestal which stood like a shining altar in the center of the chamber. Upon that pedestal, bathed in majestic golden radiance, sat the treasure they sought, the Clavis Imperium.
"Is that it?"
asked Lefty with disappointment in his voice, as he approached the pedestal and nonchalantly grabbed the treasure from where it sat gathering dust.
"This doesn't look like any key I've ever seen,"
he said, looking at Ol Blu on his shoulder.
"I thought you said it was a key or something,"
he added, looking back at the object in his hand. Indeed, the Clavis Imperium was not a key in the traditional sense, but rather a simple metallic gear, circular in shape, dark gray in color, and about a smidgen thick, with 9 long rectangular teeth spaced evenly around its circumference. Lefty held the object aloft, casting it into one of the luminescent sunbeams, and rotated it slowly as he analyzed its surface, looking for any indication that it was special or valuable in any way, but finding nothing.
"Are you sure this is it?"
he asked again, looking back towards Ol Blu, who just sat there in contemplative silence. Truth be told, Ol Blu wasn't certain. After all, no one save for Scaevolas himself and perhaps a few loyal engineers had ever actually seen the Clavis Imperium. Ol Blu knew only what he had been told, that they were in the tabernacles, and that they were essential to finding the collective wealth of At. After thinking it over thoroughly, though, he realized the keys didn't have to be literal keys. They could be anything, really. After another half-moment of silent contemplation, he finally responded.
"That's got to be it,"
he said without much confidence.
"Why else would it be here?"
he added, using the only morsel of logic he could salvage from this strange situation. The old Kickin reasoned that there was no other explanation for why this thing would be here, sat atop a majestic pillar at the top of the food tabernacle, guarded by a formerly deadly beast.
Yeah,
said Lefty after a bit, still not fully persuaded but seeing no other alternative.
I guess you're right,
he added before reaching back to stuff the rare trinket into the rucksack on his back, the valuable treasure letting out a little clink as it landed in an unorganized pile with the rest of his scant possessions. The young man took one more look around the chamber, walking around the pillar slowly to make sure he hadn't missed anything, before simply shrugging and turning to leave the room. As the two of them emerged from the hole in the wall and once again stood out in the nearly afternoon sun, Ol Blu asked a simple question.
"So, what do you plan to do now?"
This simple question stopped Lefty dead in his tracks, making the young lad pause as if he had just seen the beast rise from its grave. For a moment he stood there, his mind blank as he tried to recall information that simply didn't exist. That wordless moment soon turned into 2 moments, and then into a long, awkward silence, as Lefty continued to just stand there, staring off into the distance with unfocused eyes and a quivering lower lip, trying in vain to think of a response.
"Lefty!"
said Ol Blu a bit louder this time, breaking the young man from his trance-like state.
"Are you all right, lad?"
he asked with a mix of annoyance and concern, before repeating his question, this time a little slower.
"I said, what are you going to do now?"
This repetition finally hammered the idea into Lefty's brain, and forced him to confront the only response he had.
I don't know.
I feel like it's important to reiterate here just how little Lefty thought about his future before this day. Back in Ashtab, dreaming of the future was such a pointless endeavor that Lefty hadn't even considered it an option. Every day was exactly the same, a seemingly endless cycle of sleeping, digging, and trying desperately to pass the time in his sleepy little town. This was all his life had ever been, and aside from the occasional reminder that some king somewhere might someday ask him to fight, he had no reason to believe that things would ever change. Lefty never planned for the future before, because there was no future for him to plan for, only a continuation of the same present, a lifetime of digging sand until he grew old and died. Lefty's encounter with the chefs was the first time he had envisioned a future for himself that was better than what he already had. His brief, victorious fight had sparked in him a fiery passion for combat, and along with it, the ability to envision a future where he could experience more of it. Then, when Ol Blu had told him of the Mad King's treasure, and he realized that more fighting could lead to incredible wealth, it had transformed that little spark of passion into a tenacious, raging inferno, an uncontrollable blaze of hopes and dreams that burned so intensely that he no longer cared for anything else. That intense passion had caused him to forge onward to the top of the tabernacle with single-minded determination, continuing despite literally everything telling him he should go back, his internal fire burning so brightly that it blinded him to the extreme danger he faced, granting him courage that would one day become legendary. But, as strong as that passion was, it lacked focus. Lefty had fallen into the same trap that even experienced dreamers often fell into. He had imagined a glorious destination without giving any thought to the journey required to get there. Ol Blu's simple question had exposed this, making Lefty realize just how ignorant he had been, the Kicken's words acting like heaping shovels of sand being dumped unceremoniously onto the fire that was his ambition. This sudden realization hit Lefty so hard that it literally staggered him, his steps wavering with uncertainty, giving him a strong desire to sit down. After a few wobbly strides, the young man took a seat near the chicken's former nest, resting on a somewhat flat rock roughly the size of a chair. Once there, he began staring down with existential melancholy at the disorganized mess of stones, bones, and discarded feathers that the beast had left behind, trying to gather his thoughts as one realization fell onto another, tumbling down like a row of dominoes, the weight of everything he had done in the previous days finally collapsing in on him.
I don't know,
he said, repeating his earlier words.
I mean, I know there's other tabernacles and other keys, but...
he began, before pausing a moment to look over at Ol Blu. The concerned Kicken was now standing on the rock beside him, giving Lefty a look of friendly empathy that the young man simply couldn't bear to return.
But, I don't really know anything about them. And, even if you had told me, I'd still need to get to them. And I don't really have anywhere to live. I don't know anyone but you. I don't even know how to get food. I, just have no idea what I'm doing at all,
he added, overwhelmed by his situation, as he observed for the first time just how massive the land ahead of him was. From their little spot halfway up the mountain, the rest of At was spread out before them, seemingly infinite, endless green treetops expanding into the distance, their leaves like nothing the desert dweller had ever seen before, only serving to reinforce just how lost he was. Ol Blu didn't respond for quite some time. The elderly Kicken sat there, thinking long and hard about what he should do. He knew that he could help Lefty. In his centuries of life, he had acquired all the knowledge he would need to guide this young man on whatever journey he could want to go on. Even if obtaining the other 8 Clavis Imperium was an impossible goal, he knew from experience that Lefty had the potential to be great in his own right. Sure, he hadn't actually defeated the beast, but it had taken a special kind of courage to even try. Those 3 chefs who had held Ol Blu captive for the past week had never shut up about how they would be the ones to finally conquer the food tabernacle. And yet, in the week they had spent there, they hadn't even journeyed beyond the ground floor. The trio instead wasted their time with big talk and endless planning, even going so far as to have a drunken celebration for the victory they hadn't even made any progress towards. There were so many people like them, people of skill who lack ambition and courage, qualities which Lefty had in spades, even if he didn't yet have the skills to back them up. Those same qualities that made Ol Blu want to help, however, were the same ones that gave him pause. He had been in this situation before, and he knew from experience that the decision to encourage or discourage this promising young man might have monumental repercussions, not just for himself, but for the entire world. Perhaps one day I'll be able to tell you about Ol Blu's past, Perhaps then maybe you'll understand just how significant this moment was to him, and why he hesitated for so long to help someone who had only shown him kindness. But this is not the tragic tale of Ol Blu. This is the legend of Lefty, and for better or worse, Lefty would never learn what had happened to Ol Blu so long ago. Nor would he ever truly understand why, when he finally spoke, Ol Blu asked such an unusual question.
Lefty, tell me, when you go to sleep, what do you dream about?
Ol Blu asked, now also staring out into the horizon, trying not to show any emotion that might indicate what he expected Lefty to say, catching the young man a bit off guard with the seemingly random question.
Responded Lefty initially. I don't think I've ever had a dream,
he said, before suddenly remembering the one that he had woken up from just that morning.
Oh wait, no. I had a dream last night, actually,
he added, making Ol Blu's ears twitch involuntarily.
I dreamed that I went back home, and then I went to bed. Sounds really boring, but it was actually kind of nice.
And, that's the only dream you've ever had?
Ol Blu asked.
Yeah, the only one I can remember, at least,
Lefty responded, finally turning away from the horizon and looking down at Ol Blu.
Why does it matter? What do dreams have to do with anything?
He inquired. Ol Blu took a deep breath and turned back to face Lefty.
Do you really want to be king, Lefty?
He asked directly, ignoring the young man's question entirely.
Even if you somehow got all 9 keys, even if you found the Cash Tabernacle, what are you going to do then?
He asked, his tone much more serious than Lefty was expecting, the old kickin' repeating the same simple question that had started off this whole scene.
I don't know,
Lefty said, repeating his statement again, before suddenly adding,
I guess it's just something to do.
This little addendum to his response was like a switch in Lefty's brain. The young man gave a little chuckle as he thought about it, starting off a chain reaction in his mind.
Yeah, I mean really, what else am I gonna do? Just go back to that stupid little town and dig for the rest of my life? No,
he said, thinking out loud and answering his own rhetorical question.
Yeah, they have food and beds there, but that's all they have.
His voice echoed across the stone cliffs behind him as he stood from his spot, his footing solid now. He was still processing his thoughts, but he had his foundation. He was at least certain about one thing. He never wished to return home.
I want to see something new. I want to meet some new people and see some new places,
he added a second later, his voice conveying about as much excitement as it could, carrying out over the countryside as he built upon his one certainty, and everything finally snapped into place. In that moment, the young man realized that what he wanted all this time, and why he wanted it, could be summed up in a single word.
Adventure,
he half whispered, as if he had just realized for the first time what that word actually meant.
Yeah, better to go out there and at least try to be interesting,
he said, finalizing his thoughts as he stared once more out into the endless landscape of At. This time, however, the sight reignited the flames within him. No longer was the world in front of him frightening and alien. Instead, the young man was eager to learn what this strange green sea looked like up close. And that was enough for Ol Blu to make up his mind.
All right, then,
he said as he hopped down from his spot on the rock and made his way around the beast's nest and towards the edge of the cliff.
In that case, we'll probably want to head towards the capital. I'm sure there are a lot of people there who'll be very interested in seeing that key you've got,
he said, motioning towards Lefty's rucksack, before turning back to the vast forested expanse.
There's a town down there. A strange little chameleon settlement. They might be willing to give us a ride into the city, or at least point us in the right direction,"
he added, turning his wing towards a particular spot in the forest where the trees broke away, and a small dot of watery blue was visible.
"We should head there first. If we start now, we might be able to make it before nightfall,"
he added, before turning back to Lefty and frowning as he discovered that the boy wasn't even looking at him, but instead seemed preoccupied with something in the beast's nest.
"Lefty!"
Old Blue shouted, his voice raising in annoyance.
"Are you even listening to me? I am trying to tell you our plan."
Lefty, however, was too engrossed in what he had discovered to answer his companion. Bending down, he reached into the nest and grabbed from it 2 metallic feathers which had caught his eye. They were just the right size, about a hand longer than his shovel, but much wider, the circular center quill fitting perfectly into the palm of his hand. As he lifted them up, he found they were surprisingly lightweight, feeling just a little heavier than his shovel, despite being much larger and far more sturdy than the familiar tool. Looking at them closer, he could see just how sharp they were. Amplified to such a large size and hardened like steel, the normally soft and ticklish follicles of the feather instead resembled a giant serrated blade, at least on one side. The asymmetrical thing was far more blunt on the other side, where the individual fibers of the feather had melded together to form a single smooth edge. Lefty swung the feathers, and was taken aback at how they seemed to cut through the air itself with a satisfying swish. As Lefty swung the feathers back and forth, experimenting with how slight changes in the angle of his wrist affected their trajectory, Old Blue couldn't help but smile. He made his way back over to Lefty, too amused by the young man's simple, almost childlike enjoyment to be angry at him.
"Found yourself some new swords there, have you?"
he asked with a chuckle, his words making Lefty's eyes widen in sudden realization.
"Oh, you really think I could use these as swords?"
he asked excitedly, the prospect not even occurring to him.
"Well, I wouldn't recommend it,"
responded Old Blue with another little laugh.
"though they'd probably make better weapons than your shovel. At least until we get you a proper sword."
Lefty's eyes glowed once more as he looked down at the feathers, his inexperienced mind again having a fantastic vision of future combat, this time conjuring up the image of himself leaping around with twin feather blades, using them to cut down some gigantic metal pig, which he assumed would be the beast at the top of the next tabernacle. With a grin, he placed the 2 feathers into one hand and then reached back into his rucksack, pulling from it his trusty shovel which had served him well for so many years. And then, without even a second thought, he flung it off the side of the mountain.
"What did you do that for?"
asked Old Blue, clearly not expecting such behavior.
"I've got new weapons,"
said Lefty matter-of-factly, waving the 2 feathers lightly through the air, as if Old Blue could have possibly forgotten about them.
"I don't need 2.
he added as he walked back towards his companion, his attitude making Old Blue sigh nervously, the kickin' beginning to second-guess himself.
"I hope you don't toss me off a cliff if you find another friend,"
he said, rolling his eyes.
"No way,"
said Lefty, as he reached down and picked up Old Blue, placing the little guy once more on his shoulder.
"That was just a shovel. People are more important than shovels,"
he said with certainty, his words boosting Old Blue's confidence in him once more, as the 2 walked right up to the edge of the cliff, looking down at the sheer rocky drop below them.
"Yeah, you're right,"
Old Blue said.
"Although, what are you going to do if you need to dig?"
His question made Lefty frown, as he realized he didn't consider that. The self-disappointment lasted only a second, though, before the young man grinned and responded with,
"Well, I guess I'll just use my hands then."
As Old Blue chuckled from the line, Lefty brought his hands together, transferring his new weapon so that he was once more holding a feather in each hand.
"Speaking of which,"
he said as he began flapping his arms up and down,
"I was thinking, instead of walking all the way down to town, why don't we just use these feathers and fly there?"
he said, showing off that not only had he been listening to Old Blue's plan, but that it had been the reason he had picked up the feathers in the first place. Old Blue, being a winged creature himself, capable of limited flight, laughed heartily at this suggestion, knowing just how absurd the idea was.
"Oh yeah, I'm sure that would work,"
he said with obvious sarcasm, certain that Lefty was simply making a joke. He was not. Old Blue quickly realized this, as Lefty took several quick lunging steps and jumped off the edge of the cliff.